Hi, welcome to the 14-day weather forecast. In a nutshell, I think the next 2 weeks are looking very mixed, but I'll start with the view across Europe and the North Atlantic. The animation runs from 18 GMT, Tuesday, October the 4th. And already at the outset, there's a strong, vigorous west or southwesterly flow covering the UK. That's bringing outbreaks of rain there to parts of northern England, Wales and the southwest. Ahead of them in the southeast, it's still mostly dry and showery conditions are falling into Scotland and Northern Ireland. A very changeable or unsettled pattern, and really that continues in the short term. Showers or long spells of rain, but mostly in the north and the west of the UK, often drier in the south and the east. Then, as we head into the weekend, high pressure starts to build for a time at least. Drier, quite probably in much of the UK there. Still some rain in the northwest on Saturday there, Western Scotland, Northern Ireland, but elsewhere it's a more settled picture, at least for a time, because as we head through Sunday and into the early part of next week, the Atlantic comes back with a vengeance. The isobars packed tightly together there, indicating the possibility of strong winds again, and also just at the end here, heavy outbreaks of rain shown by the yellow shading pushing across southern and central counties. At this range, of course, the details are very much up for grabs. Could well be significantly different to what this is showing, but the general pattern across the North Atlantic does seem to be quite well set. Taking a look at the jet stream, because that's what's driving things. Initially, there's quite a strong jet stream heading over Scotland there into Scandinavia. Through the week, it weakens initially, but it's still making a beeline towards the UK. And then at the end, into the early part of next week, it strengthens once again and pushes right across us. It's perhaps showing signs of being a little bit further south than is typical, but not a great deal. What that would hint at, though, is it becoming very wet across the UK into the first half of next week, as the GFS sequence was showing. Temperatures, with winds coming in from the west, that positive NAO pattern, North Atlantic Oscillation, low pressure close to Iceland, high pressure near to the Azores. It isn't going to be cold. 16s, 17s, 18s perhaps in southern England on Wednesday, cooler as you head further north. By Friday, very similar really, still respectable there for the time of year, 18s, 19s, perhaps 20 in eastern England. Once more, temperatures dip as you go into Scotland and northern parts of the UK generally. By Sunday, well, it's rinse and repeat, maybe a degree or so lower, but not much changes. And even by Tuesday, once more, it's rather mild, I think, in most areas, especially in eastern Britain, there 16s, 17s, quite uniform. And with that really quite vigorous flow moving across the Atlantic, across the UK, rather strong winds on many days, there isn't much chance of night frost at all. I mentioned the strength of the winds. This is the MOGREPS wind gust forecast plot for London. Often quite breezy or windy, 40 miles an hour, 30s on some days. Not terribly strong winds in southern Britain being forecast at this stage, but definitely something to keep an eye on. Move northwards. The chart here is for Edinburgh, and the maximum gusts are somewhat higher. 50 on a number of the runs, even one there going up towards 60 relatively early in the period, although it is an outlier. But as I say, a strong Atlantic flow through the first week is favoured for much of the time, just with that high pressure building up from the south during the weekend for maybe a couple of days. What that means for rain forecasts, days 0 to 5 here. ECM projection is on the left and the GFS one on the right. Reasonably consistent, very wet in the northwest, over 100 millimetres of rain accumulating through this period if these models are correct. Much drier as you head down into southeastern Britain. Jumping forwards now, days 0 to 10, the rain continues stacking up in the northwest, very high totals, over 200 millimetres in places according to both of these. Once more though, it's drier as you move down into southern and eastern counties, although GFS on the right there suggesting around 20 millimetres or so in parts of southern England. ECM has somewhat lower totals, but the patterns which they both show are very, very similar in terms of rainfall distribution. So, at the end of week 1, do the deterministic models agree with each other or have they all diverged? GFS, Tuesday the 11th, high pressure having more influence in southern Britain, but it's an Atlantic-based pattern. And it's a similar story with the Canadian model, high pressure there to the south, low pressure to the northwest. The German ICON model, not a great deal of difference. The European ECM, though, perhaps showing high pressure being more influential at this stage, although I think even on this it would be quite transient, as I've been hinting. Somewhat dry for a time, maybe a couple of days on all these models, but the general theme is a changeable one. And finally, the UK Met Office, once more, this is probably closer to the ECM than the GFS, with high pressure being somewhat more influential at this point across the southern half of the UK, but generally it's a southwest or westerly based pattern moving across all areas. Therefore, at the end of week 1, it's changeable, wettest in the north, driest in the south, winds coming in from the west for southwest. It's not going to be particularly cold anywhere, probably above average temperatures in southern and central regions, close to the norm as you head further northwards. Well, that covers the first week, but what about the trends and the probabilities as we go through week 2? Starting with the 16-day GEFS plot for London. Air mass temperatures across the top are quite interesting because there is a signal here for them to dip below the 30-year average. The thick purple line there, the ensemble mean, falls below the thick black line and it stays underneath it for much of the period. And that general trend has been consistent in recent updates, so quite well supported. Rain across the bottom, an ongoing risk, a number of spikes there, not a huge number of them, but there will be rain on some days I would expect. Although towards the very end there is a signal, a tentative one, for it to begin turning drier. The number of rain spikes decreases. 2 metre temperatures for London, well, probably above the average early on, but it's dipping. They are dipping. The amount of yellows increases. Those are runs going for between 11 and 15 Celsius, even a little bit of green there. So the temperature profile down at the surface seems to match the upper air one quite well. So the 850 HPA temperature profile, which I showed on the previous slide, which had the decreasing values as we went through week 2, that's been mirrored here down at the ground level, which isn't always the case. Up to Manchester, the air mass temperature profile, very, very similar. It's dipping below the average, and also the rain forecasts are quite similar to the London one, although generally a little bit wetter here. There are more spikes, but the overall pattern is the same, hinting at drier conditions there towards the very end. The 2 metre temperature data table, again consistent, mostly yellows, greens appearing later on, so runs going for maximums between 6 and 10 Celsius, but mostly between 11 and 15, perhaps that trend there towards cooler, lower values later, showing once more. Now, the Glasgow plot, once more, the air temperature profile, very consistent, slightly below the average. There are, though, quite a few rain spikes showing significantly more than were on the Manchester and London charts, so wetter in the northwest, and that really fits in nicely with those accumulated totals that I showed earlier, which had very, very high rainfall amounts in Western Scotland. The 2-metre temperature data table for Glasgow. Greens there becoming dominant, so 6 to 10 Celsius. Still some yellow showing up, increasing a little bit again later on, the 11s to 15s. Definitely though cooler and wetter as you head northwest. Very, very typical, with a positive North Atlantic oscillation pattern being well established. The 10-day GEFS mean surface level pressure plot just reinforces the message. Low pressure close to Iceland, high pressure to the southwest, somewhere near to the Azores, the UK under this westerly flow. And the European model shows a similar setup, low pressure, high pressure, the UK there sandwiched between them. And finally, the data table showing the mean surface level pressure forecast from all of the runs in the GEFS for York has this period of lower pressure there where greens become very dominant through the second week, so 996 to 1010 millibars. Towards the end though, the amounts of yellow increase, 1011 to 1020 25 millibars, and there's even a little bit of orange. That's backing up the idea that there is a signal at least for it to start to become more settled and drier through the last few days. But all in all, it's a mixed picture, very typical, with low pressure sitting somewhere close to Iceland and high pressure near the Azores. So to summarize, week 1, it's a changeable theme, windy at times, particularly in the north, also wettest in the north, although all parts of the UK will see some rain. Temperatures close to or above the average generally, with winds coming in from the west or the southwest for much of the time. There's also that signal for high pressure to have more influence, at least for a couple of days, building up from the south. Week 2, rather unsettled, with a risk of rain in all areas, but once more the wettest conditions in the north for much of the period. Temperatures dip, could become a little bit below the norm, at least on some days. But towards the very end, there are indications of high pressure starting to return and more settled conditions building back in. So there we have it, a very typical period of weather, I think almost textbook for the UK in many ways, with low pressure close to Iceland and high pressure close to the Azores, a westerly or southwesterly flow cutting across the Atlantic and pushing over the UK. Typical for autumn. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, then please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. Thank you for watching now. Bye.